당도 잠바지냐 시야디 레단 데네자 나 잠바냐자 시야디 아네 뭐 간시 람나 다제 가서 류당 초와당 셈나去 아네 시来灭绝 데네 시보 강로지来灭绝 让大家低点多的让给成一代几成你以后呢大些钱呢见到光别个占把当写了刚人的对比蓝书的看法是的你记了就占把你下下的我都是能够算下去但的那个占把你下的个的的那个光明的语的啦看有是呢绿的三的个错话的三的去西伯的下个了解没办的律什么就西的这些，我都是，你开始讲做，但没把律给点到，让其成年已经大了，我们那点俺就开始第一个写啥子是吧
Good morning. So we've been looking for a few weeks now at the presentation on the 4 close placements of mindfulness. So the entity or the meaning of a close placement of mindfulness is presented in our text. We've yet to come to it, but we can talk about it again. And that's the entity on page 6, outline D. So the entity of a close placement of mindfulness is an exalted wisdom engaged in practicing a path included in mindfulness and wisdom, having investigated the general or specific characteristics of any of the 4 body, feelings, mind, and phenomena. In looking at what this practice then, or the 4 close placements, we started in the first outline to look at the 4 observed objects, those being firstly body, and then feelings, thereafter mind, and phenomena. And now we've come to the second outline, the way to perform this meditation. And here we've looked at that there are a couple of divisions, the shared or the common and the uncommon, and we've been looking at the first of that division, the common way to meditate on the 4 close placements, and we did so last time looking at the common way to meditate on the close placement of mindfulness onto the observed objects of the body. And we saw that one does this first through meditating on the specific characteristic of the body, and thereafter on the 4 general characteristics of the body.
Andele tiro raja ane su tiro raja shiche denigi ge chope ge chonen jubdu gengi ane su rungwa jela ane rangi chengi sa de sukse de deni che do a sembe ge samda de rangi chengi che ba samda rangi chengi sa de ne che ngo so da ji chengi se de da su gi tian do ane ka ji chengi de gare la na ane mita ba da du ma wa da 동화다 담에 바세의 시보들라 지층이 셔와다 제자다디 간저게 수기된도 다 지층이 제바체도 담보 수디 안 베네데니 시에도 와서 뭐선 차위 제라 안다 수디 기지기지 지바 안니 잠담이다 와서 좀 제가 기지기지 지비 김장 간에 지기도 가르세 가제 내기도 뒤인가제 내기도 sen 제바체도 미다바지거와 언데니게 제바체 잠바 땡제 안니 셔럽게 제바체 고면도 ane chi chenyi midaba komyada. Tene du ngawa se komyada pungpodi da ganes kikido se de gyu le da nyomo pale tene kikiyo pati paa jeba je. Tene pungpo se de le da nyomo onge junwi ke che da rangwa meba le da nyomo onge xiangwa do gyu peke resha. Tese pungpo tela tene dunga do gyuwe dunga ye de chasa tene ke nue ro shi resha senpeke tene ke jeba je ne hako ydo ne samda komyadi. 다들에 잠바된 시를 고면디 아니 동화고 검체 시라와 다 동화 세대 다셔롱아 진이 집에 동화 세대 수디 규단健康来嘛对吧让往呀人民都受到具的建立的那个吧一下现在给几把的下的个米大把这给几基础都给几米几别大把呀人民都下的但呢个수디 풍부하다 야라 제 차시에 망고실 되는 주도 데 차시라 마되바 안지부아리미도 제가 되네자 수디 풍바나 가소래 다시랑화진 주표 동아래 샤스메 되네 제바 조금나디 지체니 다시랑화 진 주표 동아세 제바 제타제 다 다음에 발라윈도 간사랑 유튜브 주표 다음에 봐세데 어디 간사 세디에나 그나 견가라마 랑응은 주표 간사디 요마레 제사 되네 매바스 되네 간사디기 풍보디 롱체샤 마두바레 선제바 조금야디 다 간사게 된도 아니 가서 지체니시 도 선생바시 검수디 그생하죠 시에사시로데.
And to briefly recap what we looked at in the how to meditate on the close placement of mindfulness onto the observed object of the body. As with all four observed objects, one starts with, firstly, with a specific characteristic. We saw at the top of page 4 that the specific characteristic of the body is the entity of elements and composites of the elements. So what that means is that the body is comprised of the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind. And from this, the composites that arise, what has arisen from the elements, namely form, sound, smell, and touch, or objects of form, sound, smell, and touch. So here one investigates to see that this is in fact the entity of the body. Thereafter, one meditates on the four general characteristics of the body, starting with impermanence. Here one meditates that the body is indeed impermanent in that it changes momentarily, that the body is not permanent but changes momentarily. And we engage in this meditation and all these meditations with wisdom as well as mindfulness, with both of these mental factors. Thereafter, having investigated the general characteristic of impermanence, one investigates that of suffering, seeing that the body, the observed objects of the body, comes about in dependence on causes. And what are those causes? Contaminated karma accumulated by our own afflicted minds. And therefore, because the causes are contaminated karma, this body was achieved without or attained without any freedom. We didn't have direct choice over that we will take this particular body. So therefore, this physical aggregate is in the nature of suffering. It's not that it is suffering, it's in the nature of suffering because of its causes. Its causes are in the nature of suffering because they contaminate the karma that led to the propulsion without freedom of this body. That karma is contaminated because it came from afflicted minds, which have at their root ignorance. So that's how we meditate on the second general characteristic of suffering, and the third of empty. So in a previous translation of the book, I called it emptiness. It more correctly here is empty. So what does the general characteristic of empty refer to? That the observed object of the body, or the form aggregate, is empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. And here we looked at last time what the meaning of this is. The body is empty of being permanent because it changes momentarily. It is actually impermanent. Secondly, it is empty of being unitary or single because it is dependent on many parts, and for example the limbs and other parts of the form aggregate, parts of the body. Thirdly, the body is also empty of being independent. Why is it empty of being independent? Because it is dependent on causes and conditions. So in this way, we meditate on the third general characteristic of empty. Fourthly, the fourth characteristic of selflessness. So the person is selfless because it is not independent but rather dependent on the aggregates. So therefore, the person is also selfless.
안저 담아 동바세디 다디 셰디 안저 가사랑시 주비세 동바세디 시거로와 되네 나가서 되니기 전시 선반 남기에다 잠만야자 komya 되네 kom베기 제바체 kom이 람데라 네 잠만야자라고 그래서 되니기 제바체 kom베기 잠바다 시립 안에 대당 손는 그 손된 요커 셈나 셈주 차상래 안에 잠만야자라고 그래서 데 람레스 되네 자당 아주이네 안에 아주기 kom야데 잠만야자 당아주래 잠만야자 깨매나야 잠만야자 전시만의 고마는 미바다 남바 집어 저부 삼다지 고며 여러와 지산 잠만야자 고며 여러와 되네자 안주교 공바이나 다스 당보 소소 류디라 삼다 소소 류디다 간지 주요래 선배 삼다데 다 소소 류디나 즉 사주멜로 시다 지저라자 수지저라자 시 아니 되네기 줍디바시레샤 선배가 삼다 되네 삼다데 소소 류디레이나 지게 네나서 레어도 가르치리고도 라도 소수게 수불려 중화로 사주 멜로디 중화 참만이 봐 차야돼 되네 나나세 네나서 요야다 되네 용도와 선배게 삼다 되네 소수 류데다 딱와 팀보게 디나 네야지레도에서 베제바체 다미다바 집에치고로 소수 류 삼다에 지상 소수 류디네야 안당보 중주 마도요 마다데야 쳇쳇쳇자데는 교화로 되네게 교화로 된 딱와 팀보 메데겐 아니 직 타말이야 메바차로 되네 시샤 선배게 당아주 미다바 삼다 미다바 라바데 마라바딘 마죽 삼다다 지상다 류디 줍디에 간이 줍구리에서네 다 제살레다 녀모발레 딘 줍고라 가스네 다 줍다디 노스네 삼당아주디 제바제 고미야디 다 잠바 델레야 셰랍기도 스네 간간 두고 제바제 고미야디 아주 도스네 장도를 제야디 계침버려서 그진 디고르시 다 담말된 셰로와 타마디네 그진 되네 셰인 바제 해서면 동화 셰메든 바 동화마도 셰메어
So again, I'll just emphasize here that the correct translation of this third general characteristic is empty rather than emptiness, because it refers to the in this case, the body, the form aggregate being empty, of being permanent, unitary, and independent. So close placement of mindfulness is a meditation engaged in by bodhisattvas, those who have entered into the paths of bodhisattvas. And they they have generated, of course, a path of bodhicitta in their continuum, and therefore they are engaging in this meditation for the sake of all sentient beings. So for ourselves then, whilst we are not bodhisattvas, and therefore we will not engage in an actual close placement of mindfulness, we certainly can and should engage in a similitude. So in accordance with our own current capacity, we too engage in the meditation in the same way that the bodhisattvas do. Starting with the observed objects of the body, we investigate its specific characteristics, seeing that the body is comprised of the four elements, as well as the four composites of the elements. And we recognize that when those elements are out of harmony or out of sync, then we become ill. So if we could approach it from the perspective of when the various constituents of the body aren't in harmony, that is when we are sick. So here we can recognize that the body is comprised of these elements. Thereafter, we meditate on the general characteristics of the body. First, its impermanence. And we approach this first from the perspective of coarse impermanence, seeing how our body has changed so over this lifetime, from the point of conception and growth within the womb, how much the body developed there. Then there was birth, physical birth, and then there's been so much development from when we were infants to toddlers to children to young adults, and now to our current age. So we see this coarse impermanence. Then we need to reflect on the momentary change, that there is no stability, that phenomena such as our body are in a constant state of flux, dependent on causes and conditions. Thereafter, we come to the second general characteristic of suffering, or in the nature of suffering. So this then, here we look at the causes that have led to this body. And the causes are contaminated karma and afflictions. And therefore, because the causes of this body are contaminated karma and afflictions, this body was attained without any freedom, any control, completely dependent on our propelling karma that was accumulated due to our own afflictions. And therefore, this body is in the nature of suffering. And that concludes the review of what we've looked at thus far. Now we'll come to look at the second of the four observed objects and the way to perform this meditation in relation to the observed object of feelings.
That Sowale Jibare, that Sowale Mije, Mibay Sowale Mi, then the Soviet and the Rangi Tsini, the G Tsini, Niki, Dajo, and the Tapache Kumgorwa, and then Rangi Tsini, the G Tsini, Niki, Dane, then Jambatan, Dembingane, the Sherki Javache, and then they come bigger, the Lamshuki Chambatilla, and they got Tamanya Sigurua, Sowale Mipi Tamanya Sigurua.
Between you hearing this teaching and the previous one, if you've been engaging in the meditation and have some familiarity with the meditation thus far, then now it will be an easy bridge to come to the next observed object, because the way to perform this meditation on the second of the four observed objects, that of feelings, is the same as what we've covered thus far. With mindfulness, one holds the observed object of feelings and investigates it, the specific characteristic of feelings with wisdom. Thereafter, one holds the observed object of feelings with mindfulness, and with the mental factor of wisdom, one meditates or investigates the four general characteristics, but in relation here to feelings. So the process is the same as we have covered previously.
That's all you do. That manager come to that ranget and what did into the cheese in Jebache Comia, La cheese in your comia, cheese in Shidi, Midaba, Dunga, Tonada, Dameva said, and the Shiti Shagorwa cheese in Shitini, Shabachibarida. That ranget in the Lekabarin Urwa, the she Sugi Pumbo to Jebache, ranget in to Sukti, and Junashita. So Tiro Raja she to be Susurua di Jebacherwa. That's how I said the Rangitsini Gare Lana, so I said the Koran Ganesh does Lano or Ganesh, Koran Yoachiris, Yoachiris, just so as Jebachidu, so I said the Ganesh Jealous Chow would say Jebachidu, Koran Soa Koran, Yoyo Yuchi, Dedu, Tan, Dewada Dunga Tan, Kaya Yoigi, and the Chige, Lochiresha, Asam Jebachene, the Nigging was ready that. The
second part of the meditation on the observed objects of feelings is on the general characteristics of feelings. And these are the same four general characteristics as for the observed object of the body. Hence, they are classified as general characteristics because these characteristics are held by all four observed objects. Hence, they're general. However, where one starts the meditation is with the specific characteristic. And this characteristic is called specific because there's one that is specific. This is a characteristic that is specific to each of the observed objects individually, so they are not shared. So this is where, as previously, the meditation starts. It's with the specific characteristic. And the specific characteristic, with respect to feeling, as we see near the top of page 4, is the entity of experience. So the meaning of feeling is experience. And that is the entity of feeling and is the specific characteristic of feeling.
That's what I said. Just Soviet into Mitabada, Tonada, Damepa, Gomiala, and the Dunga Kumbala, then what saw what the Haku Hamogona, and did the Kumia Maradineza, then what saw the Wachi dini chichile chowa lagidu chowa dini ridwa sembe chowa de hako gorwa jina dini inzang choyu go ngo di hako gorwa dini inzang chowa siya de rangi ngo rangi tsingi siya de rangi tsingi de rangi ngo choyu ko ngo kani shisha sembe jeba jia de la nga zo rangi tsingi le jeba jeba la gorwa dini jeba jie de ane ga sam ji le jeba jie de kar hako gorwa sin chowa siya de ji nyongwe gi lo di la ane yana dewa yana dunga yana tanyum dini diru de Gyälwa dunga tayum kaya chi nyongwi ngo chi la ane chowa la du sem pe ha go tu ya tu burwa
The reason for each of the observed objects one starts with the specific characteristic before the general characteristics is because the specific characteristic identifies the entity or the actual, the deep meaning of the observed object. So without knowing the entity of the observed object, one's meditation on that object will be, the effectiveness of that meditation will be severely impeded. In other words, we need to understand well what we are meditating on. And the purpose of meditating on the specific characteristic of the observed object is so that one can come to understand that object well before approaching it through the four general characteristics. So therefore, with each of the observed objects, one starts with a specific characteristic, coming to understand the object well. And we see here that the entity of feelings is experience. And the experience would be through the three types of feelings of happiness, suffering, or neutral feelings.
Then chowa sadi yu dan nyongwi gi Gyälwa da dunga danyu nyongwi ngo chi nyongwi gi chi lo chi la dan chowa sa shi go re. Then chowa sadi yu Gyälwa da dunga danyu ga nyongwi gi lo chi la chowa shi go wa chi ngo sa.
There are three types of feelings: those of pleasant or happiness, those of unpleasant or suffering, and then neutral.
Zanda chowa de la yawa cheba na chowa dewa da dunga da tanyum sia da ani sum gi yawa che ngore di na shin da de chowa la wang xi ko ju chowa sia da yi xi ko ju chowa sia da ani chowa de ne ge sun ni chowa ni su che ngore an de ne ya ji ge chowa la nan ge chowa chi chowa chi na ni ge chowa sia de ne ge sum che ba ya ngore wa chi chowa nan ge chowa chi na ni ge chowa sia de.
Feelings then can be divided actually in different ways. So you can have pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And so just here in terms of translation, pleasant is often translated as happiness, and unpleasant is often translated as suffering, and neutral. A second way to translate to divide feelings is not into three, but into two, those of mental feelings and physical feelings. A third way to divide feelings is into external feelings, internal feelings, and both external and internal feelings. So that's another threefold division into external feelings, internal feelings, and both external and internal feelings.
Zanda nangi sowa labyondi nangi yu kissing hanzo nangi su tela ane chi su da nangi su da china nigi su ksin su sum chi so janzo dinashi dan nangi su wangbo la mini cho nyo yu chowa dige dan nangi chowa la gore da chi chowa la de chi su so la so ba xin na zi xin da de nigi chu da zha da zhe la so ba la mini nyo yu chowa de la chi chowa se ka yu di ko chi yu zi su yin za de la mini nyo yu chowa de chi chowa la le da china nigi chowa la de nga zo kisin china nigi lu se jorwa so ce que on den corbat qui china ni lu mi shen ni lu ti qui china ni lu ba on de so la mine nyo yu chowa de la ni china ni ge chowa sen min do sin ke ba chi go wangbo nga zo wangbo nga yo wa wangbo la mine nyo yu chowa de ge la ani nang ge ga so re nang ge chowa se 치고로 갈까서는 유디 난기 숙라민 대가지 가진하는 난기 수 치유 지난이 숙세 셔와 지난 난기 수라민의 초용유 초와데 난기 초와세 치유라민의 용유 초와데 치초와세 다 지난이게 수라민의 용유 초와데 지난이게 초와세 어두스는 제발샤
The second of the the second of the threefold divisions of feelings, that into internal feelings, external feelings, and inner and outer feelings, you may recognize the terminology fitting closely or identically with the threefold division of the observed object of the body that we looked at in our second session. So if you look at page 1 at the bottom there, where we have the threefold division of the observed object of the body, that matches to the feelings that will arise in relation to each of those respective objects. So you have the observed object of the outer body, and in relation to that arises a feeling in relation to an external. Yeah. Then the observed object of the inner body leads to a feeling relating to an internal feeling. And the third division of the observed object of the body that is both outer and inner, and there one gives rise to a feeling that is both inner and outer. So here there is an exact tie-up between the observed object of the body for each of those three divisions and the resulting a feeling that arises. So this then relates to that second type of threefold division of feelings.
Denigi tsowala sum yewa che di da de jambanye shi shi bi kapso ene andi kapso ane da de je da ngombo kundu na le ya an tsowala yewa sum de ne chigore. Je da ngombo kundu na lo de ne sungore che tsowala sum de. Je lagi mara ngombo kundu mingora tome 제발에 수 제발에서 디 민도 ngombo kundu la gorwa chi de je lobi yin je je la gorwa je labna lobi yin je barwa kundu labna papa tome ge je barwa ji jungni yore ngombo je na lobi yin ji jamba nyeje shi shebe kapla an lobi yin ji chowa sum che di nange chowa chi chowa chi na ige chowa se di je na la du song yore je 다 잠반예제 시시비가 송은보 군뒤 나라 파파 토메기 아니 초와데라 난게 초와 치소와 난게 초와세 데니기다 숨데 수이 어디 디디 그 흉가와 송열에서는 onbo 죄다 로비긴 onbo 죄 나라 잠반예 시시비가라 송열에서 파파 토메기 onbo 군뒤 가서 잠반예제 시시비가 송열에서 초와 잠반예 시비가 시 송열에제
In the two Abhidharma texts that the Four Close Placements of Mindfulness has as its source material, for both of them, when they discuss the observed object of feelings, they're dividing it in the way of inner feelings, outer feelings, and both inner and outer feelings. So this refers to Asanga's compendium of knowledge, as well as Vasubandhu's treasury of knowledge. So these two Abhidharma texts, they divide feelings into these three: internal, external, and both inner and outer, or internal and external. And that is in our context of the close placement of mindfulness, then the feelings is divided in this way. Usually this isn't the way that feelings are divided. Usually feelings are not divided into this threefold division. the way feelings are usually divided are either into those that arise from independence on the mental sense power or the sense powers. That's one common way that feelings are divided. The second common way is into feelings of happiness, feelings of suffering, and neutral feelings.
야 초와라 예와 체연도 초완 대화 초와 대화세 이데세다 대화다 이데 둥아다 이미데 안 초와 당념세네 대중의 초와 나치거래.
Further way that feelings are sometimes divided is into five, with five being mental happiness, physical suffering, and neutral feelings.
초와라 나디네 체연도 갑라 초와 대화세야 루시코기 초와들라 초와 대화라 그래. 이데라비도 이시코기 초와들라 이데라고 초와 대화들라 이데라고 그래. 루시코기 초와 대화들라 대화스입니다. 근데 이시코기 초와 대화들라 이데스입니다 그래. 그래서 대화다 이데스야 돼. 이시코기 초와 대화들라 루시코기 초와 대화들라 대화. 근데 이시코기 초와 대화들라 이데스네. 그민 대다니데 돈달라 이시코기 루시코기 초와 대화다 이시코기 초와 대화세지 이시코래.
And that fivefold division, to how it was just expressed, is the terminology that's used. To make it a little fuller so that it's clearer, we can present those five as the following: mental happiness, physical happiness, mental suffering, and physical suffering feelings. Sorry, I'm missing out the word feelings. Okay, again, mental happiness feelings, physical happiness feelings, mental suffering feelings, physical suffering feelings, and neutral feelings. So that would be the five. And what differentiates them is if the type of consciousness that they arise from. So if they come from, the feeling arises from a mental consciousness, it would be a feeling of mental happiness or mental suffering. If it arose from a physical sense consciousness, then it would, if it arose from a sense consciousness, then it could be a physical happiness or physical suffering. And then lastly, neutral feelings.
그래서 초와 둥아라도 둥아다 이미데라도 둥아라도 루시코기 초와 둥아데라 초와 둥아시 이미데라도 이시코기 초와 둥아데라 이미데에세지 다워 제가 되는 인자 완전 초와랑아 체여도 초와 대화 라변을 남상 루시코기 초와 대화도 고호래 초와 이디에 라변도 다 이시코기 초와 대화만도 루시코기 초와 대화라고 해요 말해 제가 되는 초와랑아 체여도 나 계셔야 돼 다 초와랑아 계시마셔바나 초와 대화 라변도 루시코기 초와 대화라 이시코기 초와 대화 니가 초와 대화서 고고 초 숨체야 돼 고고로 제가 초와랑아 계시제 나 체외 내가 좀 계시바나 초와 대화서야 돼 루시코기 초와 대화들하고 초와 이디엘도 이시코기 초와 대화들하고 디나신 초와 둥아 라변도 루시코기 초와 둥아들하고 이디 가서 초와 이미데라도 이시코기 초와 둥아들하고 진짜 초와 땅임서도 다 차상 찍어지 초와 왕시이나라 근데 이시이나서 초와 땅임서 걸 찍으셔야 해.
What we're seeing here in these different divisions are just different ways to come to understand well what is meant by feelings. So, especially now in what we've just mentioned in the fivefold division, that correlates is a more detailed division of what is presented in the two threefold divisions. For example, in two of the threefold divisions, for example, we can divide feelings into those arising from mental consciousness and sense consciousnesses. So that's two. Or you can have physical feelings, happy feelings, suffering feelings, and neutral feelings. So that's into three. But you can but within each of those, happy and suffering feelings would contain both those that arise from sense consciousnesses and mental consciousnesses. And if you were then to flesh that out, you take that threefold division and make it into a fivefold, taking the feelings of happiness and dividing it up into whether they are mental feelings of happiness or physical feelings of happiness, and likewise for suffering. So in this way, one can divide or come to understand feelings in greater clarity through dividing it in these differing ways. In terms of neutral feelings, or often translated as equanimity feelings, then these aren't divided in any different way. This is always just left as one division on its own. But in terms of suffering feelings and happiness feelings, then these can be divided into two each, in direct relation to whether they come from sense consciousness or mental consciousnesses, or one can just talk about feelings in terms of whether they come from sense or mental consciousnesses. So these are different ways to divide feelings to try and gain a clearer understanding of feelings.
Gyälwa chire chowas. Ta ganjele chowase di ganis janga dewa da dunga da tanyum se da janga gare si yewa gare chewe ine mena chowa korong ngo se de ganes na chowa dewa labyo sheba korong ngo dewi ngo ji che dewa nyon de inde lo de la chowa dewa la ro dunga la chowa dunga la de sheba korong chowa dunga ngo ji che ane dunga nyon de la ane chowa dunga la ro 초와 땅님 라도 샤와 코롱 아니 땅님 지금 오게제 코롱 땅님 용 오게제 아니 되니게 뇨위게 땅님 뇨디게 샤바텔라다 초와 땅님 라고로 제 간질레 초와세도 코롱 오디 그래서 뇨위 오지레 라도 코롱 뇨와 지금 오 야네 둥아 뇨위 오 주대야래 야네 둥아 뇨야 지금 오게되야래 야네 땅님 뇨와 지금 뇨위 뇨디게 오게되게 지라 아니 초와스라 그래서 number sheba la mangbu yoro ba sheba la dunga nyo yo ngo dukai yoro ma dukai yoro ba chesan sheba rik mangbu yebe nane chowa se de kanis level se ne koron dunga nyo ya ge ngo ya sheba koron dunga nyo ya ngo ya ji che nyo digen de la chowa dunga la go re che dina shin da dunga la dewa ji bare.
When we look at consciousness, there are, of course, many different types of consciousness. So here we're talking specifically about that of feeling. So feeling arises in the very entity of experience, the experience of happiness, the experience of suffering, or a neutral experience. So the very essence or entity of this consciousness feeling is either happiness or suffering or a neutral feeling, one of those three. So the very entity of this consciousness is this experience of happiness or the experience of suffering or a neutral experience.
ane jelya medo thongbe thongye du medo la ta de sheba de lik mango ro chowa dige ta gore dushe dige ta gore sene sem dige ta gore semba chowa dushe semba yila jeba raba nga se de sem da di khoju kunro nga che sheba dugi nyom de medo chi la ta du go ro ta gore de nyoyo ngo ji ne suresin chowa de ma do dushe da sheba shanda dige Denige yu dilepen medo de ninjiwodo sibi nyoa chikewena dene ngoye dewa yawodo sibi dewa nyoye ngoje ne choade de yorma mado sheba shanda dige dewa nyoye ngoje go mare ine yu dile chi miba chibare de choade gi nyoye ngoje de dewa di nyoye ngoje de gorwa shanda dige dewa di nyoye ngoje go mare yu medo jile miba chibare de 지산 denige sheba mangbu yube nane 대화 뇨위 ngoji 되게 셰바들라다 디 셰바 두고라 디나데 진짜 디네 뇨요 ngoji 되게 셰바들라 좋아스미다고 그러지 좋아라 그러지.
Every consciousness has its observed object. Consciousness always has an object, and that consciousness, it always is accompanied with 5 omnipresent mental factors, of which feeling is one. And all these five omnipresent mental factors always accompany consciousness. And they all serve a particular function. So the omnipresent mental factors are feeling, discrimination, intention, mental engagement, and contact. And they all have their own specific functions. The function of discrimination will be to if the object is seen to be pleasant or unpleasant, but it's feeling that experiences the object in the sense of experiencing pleasure or experiencing displeasure with relation to the object. So, for example, if a flower is the observed object, or perhaps someone is seeing a flower, then the function of the consciousness of feeling is to experience the experience of pleasantness or unpleasantness in relation to the object. It doesn't do, for example, the labeling or draw the mind to the object, but its entity is the experience of the object in the sense of experiencing pleasure or experiencing displeasure.
충충 레샤 sembe samlo 첨보 레샤 sembe samlo chi yungurwa dan denegi medo ta ju ka liang cho medo ning chu ju so so ya ga la la ji nyon de ji xie ba xue ji san denegi xie bi ri mong bu yue be na ne da ji cho wa se de ge ri sha se che ba chi de man zu che ba chi de ji san de ga la la ji de de nyon wi ge de wa ji nyon wi wo ji de de le cho wa la gu du ji san di medo ka bo re sha san samlo da han samlo di cho wa re me du 지나다 매도 될 미제 갈랑랑 지는 뭐 대위 뭐 줍되긴기 다시 해봐시도 디 초월에 사실 맞은 거 송고로 지나 내니게 송여도 제가 제네 안에 송여도 초월의 랑경오래 안 제가 제네 안에 뭐 랑경오 송와를 와다
So if we seeing the flower, we have our consciousness with all these mental factors. And here, the mental factors play a variety of roles. So this flower, we may be thinking about it, thinking, oh, it's for example, the color is white, its size is small, oh, it is so beautiful. So these are a variety of thoughts. And with all these thoughts, there's a feeling. Let's say it's a great pleasure in this object has arisen in the mind. A pleasure in relation to the object has arisen in the mind. And that is feeling. That is the experience of pleasure. So that is feeling. So if we're feeling joy or delight or pleasure in relation to this object, that is the role of feeling. So that is then the entity, the essence of feeling. So when we investigate and we see that whatever object we have, our consciousness has, there's a feeling associated with that, and that is a feeling of pleasure, displeasure, or neutral. And here we can now come to understand the role that, or recognize the role that feeling plays with each consciousness.
당념 가야 용용어 지레샤 섬데네 하고 차외체라 당은 디가 래 지칭이 삼다이로와 디네게자 나지나는 네네기 용위 셰바디 안에 간스 용구도 가제 받의 얘기도 당보 간에 가제 얘기도 제바체도 당보 코란 끼연도 지규단 끼연제라 되네 끼티간 끼연네 가제 얘기서는 알아서 라바라 봤음다면 데 소와 대화데 대랑 당보 대랑라 깨베네 데네 강삼 지리야 지메티비 대화데 바 예제 아지 당연히 당임래야나 야네 동할래야 되네 용도 와서 비 지상도 무슨 유어도다 데네기 제바지 유어도 삼다베나 데네 양 지금 뒤수 통을 다제 아니 가제발 얘기도 쓰리 안도 제바체도 아니 기지기지기지 지바디 디고로 다 데네나 다데 초와 대화로 지는 초와디 파게 초와디 파 예두베 가와다 게네 가르베 가데 그디바도 가구도라네 다데 가신 균투누두 파삼당하다 라바라바삼다네 베네 라바삼다네 대화디 게신에 양 주지 까마 가시 대랑라 요바시 데네 메드에 용으로 하다 라바라바라바스 두시데 다 데네기 게 세위질라 마지바 빠라딜레 되네게 동바도 뒤에 민도 삼다만 다디 매래 지상 소화세디 라 게손 남상 게 세위질라 네 남상 지루고래 지상 지루고래 지상 디니자 기지기지 지부에 오지마도 지부 오니 되바르 기지기지 지루도 하스메 삼다 되네게 제바진 지바 삼다에도 되네 디차고로 가서 미다바고 뭐 지생이 미다바 제바지 공부로 와디가 담배 땡지 담배게 소화들 봐 신제되네 봐 아니 제 시럽게 될이야 가제바도 네게도 간에 지우도 제바지 거로 와서 미다 기지기지 지바 삼다에도 되네 될이야 맞저게 미다바 삼다 기지 다 풍벌 삼다는 지바차고 그래서
So hopefully then it's clear what the meaning of the specific characteristic of feeling is, that the entity of feeling is experience. And through investigation, one will come to gain familiarity with this, the clear understanding of this. Thereafter, having reflected on the specific characteristic of the observed object of feeling, one moves, just like previously, to the general characteristics, starting with the first, of impermanence. So, impermanence then, we see that feeling, the mental factor or the consciousness of feeling, it arises in dependence on causes and conditions. So there needs to be an object to be observed by consciousness, and that leads to the arisal of feeling. And then we can, with that feeling, then we notice it arises from causes, which means it's dependent, and coming into effect in dependency on causes means it is impermanent. And if it's impermanent, it doesn't last. It doesn't last. And here we can see on a course level that in a short while, a number of feelings arise within us. Some seem to last longer, seem to dominate. Others are very fleeting. So this we can observe, and then we go a little deeper, and we can go deeper both into the causes to see why from a specific observed object a specific feeling arose, go deeper into the causes. Similarly, we go deeper into the impermanence. It's easy to recognize that feelings come and go, that they're fleeting, but we need to go a little deeper to see that they change momentarily. So even those that pass quickly, we can appreciate that they change easily. But even those that with particular mood seems to dominate us for a long time, for some hours perhaps, we need to investigate and see that feeling too changes momentarily. It is not at all stable. It is not at all reliable. So this here is how we start to meditate on the first general characteristic of impermanence, and the technique as well as the sequence is the same as what we covered before with the observed object of the body.
난데네기 다델야 둥아와 삼다베나 안 소와데 기승에 만나지 지바데 또 소와데 하나 주길로 소와게디 간스키고레 라드 아는 주기 귤라 소와 대화시켜베네 둥아시켜베네다 가르키고라서네 유디 사체기 취지라 미제 주기 풍보 다 되는 거 직접 미네 대화기도 대화기와나 둥아기와 되는 기도 되는 규디다 가르레 연구레시도 다 유디라 안 소와디게 믹스 유지고 그래 유일라테네 다 유디 여바 잠기 소와디게 두그레베 내한게 두고 말에 소와디게 녜랭규 안 녜랭규고 그래 녜랭규고 그래 지사 녜랭규디 다 거시아바치리 개왕 그래서 균가마를 파삼다 지사 균가마 삼다도 되네 균가마 삼다도 균가마디 가르 인가서 야야야 데로도 다 저기 개왕 가서르다 되네게 소와 대화다 인가서 귤라 소와 대화 간에 개베나다 동안 간에 기타용 개베는데 그런 게 녜랭이 규파 대바네 개왕 아메기 다시 가사기 규기 소와 대화 소와를 내용 그래 지상 대수 소와려야 되기 안에 간슬리기리 랍네 다 소와디 안에 대양 안에 그런 레기 대부차도 그런 레기 대부차도로 와 차디거래. 근데 디네자 가르스네 마주 풍보디 레셰 레다 녀모 온게 샹화지 기비 풍보. 지사 레다 녀모 샹화잖아. 제라 미네 초와 디르기리 미바의 유디 레다 녀모 샹화전의 기비기 레 유치제. 다 코롱 초와 코롱의 예린 유계왕 야망마 주디 내야 안 예매기 초와 대기 바차샤시비 디테고 신의 중앙인 바제. 진짜 내내게 초와 계야 대양 야마 가르쳐서 다세 말이 비군에 나제. 안 디게기 안 초와 기요 반자 당한 초와 대야 다 지게 곧 독대시 동아기를 하신 자리에서지 제바제데 되는 지고로만 소화세 대응아주 동아 덴바 삼다하네 간스 땅고라 세나가주 소화디도 기에도 가르치고 세나가주 유 사체기 류 풍보텔라미나 가 풍보라미네 소화디도 기에바이나 제상아주 풍보를 미세 유 풍보티야 레다 녀모 원주 사치기 죄래 제가 거의 미유디야 미비 유디야 사치기 죄 지난 델라미네 디도뇽베 데니기 소와 녀와 그런 예린 규야야 제바이나 제와 아미기 바샤샤셰베 데니기 녀 디 제와 아마기 소와 디도기에 바샤샤게 데니기 기에 바샤디야 규가르스네 레다 녀모 가서 그래 마리베 바차 마리바체 마리베 왕기 아니 소와 대와게 디 왕게다 소와디바 르미 직체 바샤샤 되는 인자 소와디 바 규리 제베나 타미기 규디 아주 좀 그래서 다시 마릭발에 되는 기기가 바지 다 풍부기 소와 있나다 풍부하면 지당 소와기 시월에 당아주 규를 소와기야 돼 이시에 소와기 풍부하게 돼 기에도 가지 아주 규규 소와 디둑께서 유디 가르스는 사치 류미고래 미바데 레다 녀모원지 풍 최실의 미네기고래제 다 그런 게 예능의 규도 세제바제 디향 아니 규가를 때는 기고선 타면에 다신 말이 받을 때는 기고래 되는 인자 아주게 다득게 소화디 그 동아의 라신시리 동아의 라신 답변에 소 동아나 동아 라지 뭐네제 다 유의 동아다 잡아두지기 소화 땅이면 잡아두지 동아 지사 되니게 동아디게 동아의 라시를 임에서 그런 그 미유디 류다 레다 녀모 어저 사시기 취 그런 거 규디야 안세위 야디도 다시 말이 바샤를 되는 주리 마 다시 말이 발에 되는 기디비게 되는게 취 지사 되는 상고 동아의 라시를 샤스베게 되는게 삼다데 그팀 가서 오래 지 가서 다 대징한 지 천이 동아의 템바 동아디 제바치단 식으로 와
Then look, as previously, one starts with the observed object, first to investigate its specific characteristic, thereafter moving to the general characteristics, starting with impermanence. And now we come to look at the second general characteristic, that of suffering. These feelings that we've already reflected on and seen that they're impermanent, and they're impermanent because they come about in dependence on causes and conditions, and therefore they change, and they change momentarily. Now we go a little deeper with this, and we go to the second general characteristic, that of suffering. So suffering, you remember the term is suffering, but it means in the nature of suffering, which immediately indicates to us that we're investigating here the causes. So the process of this investigation we're going to embark on now is the same as we did with the previous observed object. We investigate the deeper causes behind our feelings, and thereby see why they are in the nature of suffering. So feelings we understand in differing ways. We understand them as the mental factor of feelings, we understand them as the aggregate of feelings. Here they come down though to the same thing. There's aggregate of feeling, or this mental factor of feeling, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, mental or sense or neutral, doesn't matter. It's come about in dependence on causes. And those causes were not accumulated with freedom. They were accumulated under the control of something, under the control of afflictions. Therefore, the result of those causes, when they ripened, we didn't have control over them. They ripened under the propulsion of propelling karma, leading to these aggregates. For example, here, the feeling aggregates. And so here we're seeing that these feelings that we have, that have come from causes, those causes are contaminated karma. And the reason that karma is contaminated and not pure is because it was accumulated, mixed with afflictions, in particular the ignorance of self-grasping. And therefore, because this result now of feelings is appropriated, is an appropriated aggregate, is because it has come from contaminated karma, and that karma is contaminated because it came from the afflictions. So there's this continuity. And this is the same continuity with the previous observed object of the body, or the physical aggregate. Here it's the same with the mental factor, or the consciousness or feeling, or to express it differently, the aggregate of feeling. So here, just like previously, we see that this feeling, aggregate of feeling, is appropriated. It is in the nature of suffering because it's come from a cause of the ignorance of self-grasping. And therefore, being in the nature of suffering, it is the basis upon which we will experience, so that's the entity of feeling, it's the basis upon which we'll experience suffering. Suffering of physical and mental pain, suffering of transient happiness. And why? Because it's in the nature of suffering, which is the third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering. So here we see, so this is how we reflect on the general characteristic of suffering in relation to feelings, seeing how feelings are in the nature of suffering because they are appropriated, meaning that they are a result that has come about in dependence on a cause, being contaminated karma, and that karma is contaminated because it came from a cause itself, namely afflicted minds, particularly the ignorance of self-grasping. Thereby, we have this contaminated feelings, or these feelings which are appropriated, and therefore in the nature of suffering. So this is how one meditates on the second general characteristic of suffering.
안 라와데 말해서다. 안 저거랑 기징아마단 치미기 차셰를 뛰어봐. 랑기 유를 뛰어봐. 랑기 딘을 뛰어봐. 시뛰는 차셰를 뛰어봐다. 셴을 뛰어봐. 인자 갈라마도 베게 라와데 레민도스. 가서 지부와데 레민도스. 진짜 지부와 레민도스. 진짜 초와데래야 기징아시 차셰 몽부 도와 체도 진짜 갈 차셰 메되게 지부와 레민도스. 진짜다 초와 그런 뭐데 나 가서 규단 기간라마데 라와다 기지기지 뭐집에 따바와다 차시라마도비 지고 뒤숨초비 소디겐데 레민도 선비게 제바지디 다 제제들 다와 다시 라와시기 주변 동화삼다나 책으로 기지기 차시 기징아치 차시로 초와들 기징아마다 치마여로 차시여로
As before, then one moves to the third general characteristic, that of empty. Empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. So feelings are empty of being permanent because they are impermanent. Why are they impermanent? Because they change momentarily. So therefore, feelings are empty of being permanent. They are not stable. They are not stable and lasting. They are impermanent, subject to momentary change due to a wide variety of causes and conditions. And therefore, feelings are also not independent but dependent. Dependent on causes and conditions. So therefore, feelings are not independent but come about in dependence on a wide variety of causes and conditions. Thirdly, feelings are empty of being unitary or empty of being single. And this is because They are not single, they're not unitary, because they are dependent on parts. They're dependent on a wide number of parts. They need a basis. They're moments of time. They come about from moments of time from past life to this life, etc. So feelings are also not unitary because they are dependent on parts. So here in the third general characteristic, we reflect that feelings are empty of being permanent, of being unitary, and independent.
이게 초와티 다시랑아 진유 마주바 삼다나 지라 아니 풍보 가서 우리 규단健康来嘛对吧 아니 라와당 기지기 지방에 따바와 되는 차실라마 뒤비기 지부와 되는 숨초티에 강사 되는 라와 진유 줍디 다시랑아 줍디며 강사제 되는 강사기 되는 강사도 요마르바다 다주랑와 주주베 강사 되는 주에나 뒤순거 초되게 강사 요고 뒤 강사 요마르바 매반자 초와디 되는게 다주랑와 주주베 강사기 롱제자 말에선 롱제자 말에 그래서네 롱제자 마디 되는 강사 코로 민두 선배 제바치는 겁니 초와디 다주랑와 주주베 강사기 롱제자 마주바 삼다디 나 동화 삼다다직 되는 제거로
The two approaches that we take here in this reflection on the general characteristic of empty. That is the first, reflecting that feelings themselves are empty of being permanent because they are impermanent, they change momentarily. They're empty of being unitary because they are dependent on parts, and they're empty of being independent because they are dependent on a wide variety of causes and conditions. And the second way to approach this meditation is that the person is also empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent for the same three reasons. So the person is also empty of being permanent because the person is impermanent. The person is empty of being unitary because the person is dependent on parts, and the person is empty of being independent because the person is dependent on causes and conditions. Therefore, the person being empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent is not able to utilize feelings that are permanent, unitary, and independent. Because if the person is not in such a way, nor too would their feelings.
다데 담아데 지천이 가사랑게 튜비 제수튜비 동화 세디 검나 제바치나르바 다진의 초와들의 미제 제바치의 초와디 다 가사랑게 투바 세디 풍보다 체시에 강라이 뭐 랑고응외니 제수의 줍디ken 가사지라 가사랑게 투바 덴데 가사디 담보 메바르와 덴데 메바자 가사랑게 투비 여바이나 덴데 요고 그래서 진짜 덴데 요 말에서 덴데 메바이나 초와디 덴데게 가사랑게 투비 제수튜비 가사게 론체자 말에 세데 마임바디 마임 제바체 마임바디 세 제바체네 마임바 또비게다 요구두스네 고묘도 다 데라 에너지생이 랑게 제수튜비 동화 검수디 작으로와.
Then we move to the fourth of the general characteristics, and that is selflessness. This then relates to the subtle selflessness of the person lacking a self-sufficient substantial existence. Here one reflects that the person is not self-sufficient substantially existent in the same way as we've looked at previously, and therefore cannot utilize feelings that are self-sufficient substantially existent either.
다 될이야 좀 내가 지천에 타마 가사랑이 좀 동화 삼다다디 시에도 디 안에가 소래 차상 투모에도 투모하시고 투모와 근데 죄다 예배네 뭐 군뒤다 되네게 다도 지고 투모의 룩제네 안에 삼다다디 디시고래 제래 다 전신선바 남기용 저 고미야디 딘디도 가르고선 동반이 공부를 동반이 내가 소리나 베네 가산 수익되네 나라 다 소외되리 나라 지층이 타마 다음에 봐야지 데모트비 동반이 공부를 전선반님기 다땡아도 셰의 지당네 차상의 용접이 지용의 돈에 두모던데 기시고를 다 그런 전선 먹는게 전선 먹어도 오늘 겁나디 디엔 공부를 때 디가로 저 가르 공부해서 동반이 공부를 데모트바 최탐 가서래 소화되게 된도 denpa drupa saya diyo marese. Jizan ji tsingi denpa drupa tonga tsowa saya dang, kasan nima sheban suk saya dang, pungpo saya dang, tsowa nipo de denpa drupa ina, yudang yin che she gangla lue pa da pa tsamla ma diyo pa korong ngani ngani drup diyo pa chi yoku kures. Jizan denegi yudang che she gangla ma diyo pa ri, yudang che she lo diyo pa ri do. De ma diyo pa ma se lue pa da pa tsamla ma do, lue pa ma da pa ngoni drup 민도 삼 제바 제네 제인데 제상 풍보다 체체 강라 마데 뢰파 다바 점 마데바 랑원이 주바 세디 민도 세 고묘도 제바지 고묘도 다디 동반이 고나시고 제자인자 제세만은 비 고묘 조디 디 대소이 된도 다지 천인네 다 천인신의 조 동반이도 고묘래.
That then was the fourth general characteristic of selflessness. But just for a moment to go back to the third, that of empty. The reason then it should be translated as empty is because we're looking at a general presentation. General in the sense that it's applicable to all practitioners, no matter their aspiration, whether it's for Buddhahood or individual liberation. As well as this explanation is in accordance with the two Abhidharma texts by Asanga and Vasubandhu. So therefore, one approaches the meditation of the third point of empty in the way that has been presented, with feelings and thereafter the self being empty of being permanent, unitary and independent. A bodhisattva will approach this meditation in an additional way, because a bodhisattva is reflecting on emptiness. A bodhisattva will reflect that feelings are empty of existing inherently, that the person is empty of existing inherently, that no phenomenon exists in the way that it appears. Feelings do not exist in the way they appear. The person doesn't exist in the way they appear, but feelings in the person are merely imputed by mind. They are dependent on imputation by mind. They therefore do not exist in the way that they appear as inherently existent, but are dependent on imputation. They are not independent of imputation. So this is an additional way that bodhisattvas all will meditate on the observed object.
투모네 개발 강야마 투모 시에도 제 랑이 두비스 동화 세시 용으로 지나다 랑이 두비스 동화디 년도에 남겨 공고래 랑게 남겨 공고래 대 전시세 받는 요 공고로 와 공고래 다 조다데 디원만 레디리기래 그래서 전시세 받는지 믹스에 가르고 면서 동반이 조어지는 공고래 세시 시고로 와 So. Tomba tomba niga tomba de rangye tu bisu tu tomba sia da tomba ni sigro ba jina di jidan de xian de rangye tu bisu tu tomba gonggu ro de gonggu re che de zo de chen shi bo mix xian de de wol ma li mix xian de kon de tempo tu bi tomba de gonggu re.
I'm mentioning this because, so in our English we're looking at page 3, we see here that we in the outline under point 1, the shared or common way to meditate on 4 close placements of mindfulness. Shared or common refers to whether the practitioner is of a hero lineage, solitary realizer lineage, so in other words a Tibetan practitioner, or of the bodhisattva lineage, a Mahayanist. So this is the way that the meditation that is common to all 3 types of practitioners, or both Tibetans and Mahayanists. It's common, it's shared to them. Therefore, they meditate on the general characteristics, where the third is expressed as being empty of permanent, unitary and independent. Across on the page, where we have the point number 2, we see that this is the unique or uncommon way to meditate. And it's uncommon in that the Two Tibetan practitioners, the heroes and solitary realizers, meditate here in their own way, and the bodhisattva in a separate way. So, or in an additional way, rather. So the bodhisattva approaches the general characteristic of empty, briefly meditating on the observed object of the body or feelings, as well as the person, as being empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent, and then primarily will meditate on the observed object of the body or feelings, as well as the person being empty of inherent existence. In other words, emptiness. So the bodhisattva will primarily meditate on emptiness, but prior to that, briefly, on being empty of permanent, unitary, and independent. Primarily, will meditate on the emptiness of inherent existence.
And then the Chowa mi che rang na chi chini yu kom yo de ane Chowa horang le ya sam da we na da nga jugi Chowa de la mi ne kom yo de ane gar chene mi gung go re sine nga ju Chowa la gar chene Chowa le mi che ane ji de gar chene Chowa le Chowa gung go Chowa gi go re se de da nga ju le dewa de ba Chowa dewa de Chowa dewa de ne Chowa dewa de ba da Chowa dunga mi de ba nga su gi le gi na gi go ba chi sa Chowa de long ju gi shi se de chi sa Chowa dewa de go re chi sa da Chowa de la gar chin yung go se ne Chowa dewa de ba yin zang Chowa dewa de che dewa de ra ye ge don da la le ga da ma ra chi go re che de chi sa Chowa dewa de la mi bi gi nga ju gi Chowa dewa de yang nga ju gi dina nga ju gi la khare son Chowa dewa de yang takpa ching go re takpa ching me ta sing gi go re chin Chowa dewa de le mi de Chowa dewa de le mi Chowa dewa ju bi gi demba ju ba ching go re di chin Chowa de di de ne gi ba ma se di gen chin nga Chowa dewa de ne ne ga chi go se ne shen ya and jige Chowa dewa jile chakwa hore, dewa du chakwa wangi, ane shen simja so cheba la so bata, shen ki jala kuma kuwa la so bata, ane shen liya dini ki jidu, ane nga zuki le ngamba, ane mungbu sa yung hore che le. Chizan le ngamba mungbu sa yung hore. Chizan chowa dewa la chakwa genche ne, ane shen ki jala kuwa, so chowa dewa digi cha ne, ane di jala di dewa ki, dini dela gyöwe kuma guya dang, an shen ki jala choya dang, an shen simcha so chöba la soba dang, shen guhor dang ya la soba. Dini ya che du, an disu chasang, di gengi dang an zo liangan ba sa ru gore, dipa sa gore, liangan ba sa gore che. An di na shi, chowa midyo ba chi, chowa dewa dunga si ki, chowa dunga le dugu ma re. Dugu me an zang an zo chowa dunga le midyo ba yin zang, dang an zo pa shio digi, di nga le chowa dunga le jegi re sam che, an mi na da kare nyo si china desilia pa nyo ba ki ya ane kanga che ya mya ba su ya da an dini shi ne anzo busun su ya digi dini su go ro da busun le de so su bol nyo na si da chowa dunga ki che sa di dunga de gu gu me san dini busun su ya la so ba dini shi ya de an sem che so che ya da shan la nyo ba ki ya kanga che ya ma wo le ya de di gi ne le ngan ba sa che san de ngan ba sa de le ngan ba digi on ge da gar gi go se ne ko wa lang dunga nyongwa ya nyawa da kasi nga son kiya da chisang di kiya da chisang kowa da nga son da kiya ki yuzo di karachin lesan le da nyong le kiya da nyong mobo ongi kiyo le da nyong mobo da ya nga zu miye di chowa de la dine chowa deduk le mi che an le deduk ki chisang dine inza da nga zu kiyo chowa deduk di kunjung kiyo dunga khorong da kowa da nga son kiya yu chayi do us chisang dine inza jeba cheyo du ane chowa le mi che jeba cheyo du kara hagu gore se ne chesa nga zo kunju denpa se hagu tu gore chesa dene le sa le ngambe ongi chesa nga zo dunga nyoya da kowa le kia da nyawa ida dunro le kia wa chesa nga kia goya ki yu di le da nyomomba le dine kiki du was chesa le da nyomomba kanis ligu se ne chowa dewa la chakpe ongi le da ngamba sa chowa dunga midyo ba de chowa midyo dunga di le dradu ke samba ki di wangi da nyomo ba ki ne de le ngamba sa dine chine kowa ki du se de Denige Chowale Jeba Jedu, Kunju Dembala Jeba Jeba Chara. Jeza Kunju de Benis Haward, Kowale Gay, Dunga, Noya, Yu, Deneshi, Udua, Semi Kunju de Benis Haward, Jezanga Dembashi, some Tabaina, Dembashi, Kunju Dembigi, Chowala, Mina Jamania Gomne, then some Nadu, and then Mazu, Kunju Dembigi, Namshala Jeba Jade, little water, and the Dimazem, Tangazuki, Kiwo Chungi. Gyälwa tingge lamjiri manam samtang yu jeza kowe dunga dine yuwa dine yungdwa deza dine ki kowali kiya yu gyu dele di matanda tabmido dele targudu di banggudu sempeke samba kiya yu tarba dungi ki samba kiya yu dine nga zuki gyälwa tingge lamjiri be namsha tarba dungi samba di gazo di bangbe bangba se hago du ngok dele jeba jaya da dine ligurwa 다당아제를 소화 재배 지병한 주 군주인 림백이 남샤들 하고도 그것은 가상한 저기 군이 풍보를 재바 지리 동아디바 남샤 지사 풍보디 동아기 라시레샤서 다 디링한저디 소화들 지사 소화 될 때는 두수스게데 지사 동아기에 그 풍보디게 유시사 레다 녀모발한테 기기도 레다 녀모바디 소화 대화를 차배 차화 소화 동아를 자되게 차화 깨지 리긴기다 량한 바사기도세 디지도 한저 군주인 발이야 재바지 군주인 벤디스 하고도 그러지
Amongst the four observed objects of mindfulness, of close placement of mindfulness, why do we even look at feelings? Why are feelings considered? Well, on a more superficial level, it's because we all want happiness. We all want to be freed from suffering and pain. And this is feelings, isn't it? Happiness, as we've seen, is a feeling. Suffering is a feeling. We experience happiness, we experience suffering. And therefore, we observe and investigate with mindfulness and wisdom feelings, the source of feelings, how they arise, what they are, how they arise. Because there's one type we want, happiness. There's one type we don't want, suffering. But we need to then go a lot deeper than that and recognize through our investigation that it's this craving that we have for feelings of happiness, including just slight feelings of happiness, that leads us to engage in all the variety of activities that we do. So here we think about the feelings of happiness, what we call it, pleasant feelings, the craving that comes about for this. And for these to experience ever more pleasure, we engage in a wide variety of activities. And we, even where we know those activities are not virtuous, we still engage in them. And we do this because of craving for happiness and thinking that this happiness or this pleasure is permanent. So this doesn't mean we necessarily consciously believe that happiness is permanent, but we grasp at it as such. Hence, our surprise at its arisal and our surprise or disappointment at its loss. Or express that a bit better, our joy at the arisal of pleasure and our disappointment at its loss. So here we see how we grasp at happiness as being permanent. Moreover, we grasp at it as being inherently existent, that this is true happiness, happiness worthy of grasping at. So in dependence on grasping for happiness, and grasping at it as being permanent, inherently existent, attachment arises. And this attachment, even if it doesn't completely dominate our mind, it does pervade our mind. It often will dominate our mind, but it certainly will pervade our mind, and therefore in dependence on this, we engage in a wide variety of activities, many of which bring harm to others, whether it be killing, whether it be stealing, deceiving others, taking advantage of others, and thereby accumulate so much non-virtue, so much non-virtuous karma. So this is why we need to investigate the observed object of feelings, and this is the one type, those are pleasant or happy feelings. And this process is the same for unpleasant feelings or suffering feelings. And we see here, we observe how we respond to suffering feelings or unpleasant feelings. For example, should an insect merely be going about its own business, flying around our head, perhaps landing on our body? And certainly if it bites us, we see how we respond to the arisal of the suffering feeling. The suffering feeling that arises just from the sound of the flying insect, just perhaps from the sight of the crawling insect. And that suffering feeling arises and we respond. We may even respond in a way to kill that insect that is common in the world. Or respond in another way to push this being away from us. In this way we see how from the arisal of a mere unpleasant feeling, so much harm is brought in this world, so much harm to others, and through the karma, to ourselves too. So investigating feelings in the deeper level, we come to understand that it's due to the arisal of feelings and us grasping at pleasant, or grasping at unpleasant, wanting to push them away, that the circle of the wheel of life, the circling and cyclic existence continues to turn. The wheel of cyclic existence continues to turn through beings being propelled for craving pleasure and grasping at pushing away unpleasant feelings. And from this, so much negative karma is accumulated, or at the very least, contaminated karma is accumulated. So here we look at how our ongoing suffering, our ongoing torment, this is entwined with feelings. And this leads us to understand true origins. Previously, when we were reflecting on the observed object of the body, we saw how through meditating in the way described, through the specific characteristic and then the four general characteristics, we come to understand true sufferings. Now, through meditating on the second observed object, that of feelings, one comes to understand the second noble truth of true origins. And this is a practice that all need to engage in, whichever lineage. Certainly in the practices shared with those of intermediate capacity, they engage in this meditation to generate definite emergence, coming to understand the true origins of our suffering, coming to understand here the relationship between pleasant and unpleasant feelings, and us being continued to remain bound in the torment of samsara. So this is why this is such an important meditation, the meditation of mindfulness and wisdom on the observed object of feelings.
Ni sheba mangbu yubi nane chowa kandish tu se samlata chowa se di chesan da rangi samlo nalya sem chowa kandish ki yudu chesan chowa se di sheba di dedu kayangi ngo nyon du kin shebi deni ki nyon yung ngo ki edu kenki ane sheba chelo chowa lagi duwa sebe samlata deni ki chowa diya da nga zuki kechi chiba dan gyudan kienla dyoba redu mindu ane kandish yungu du da ko deni ki cheba che nga zuki de mitaba samdaya da denige da doshene ndiane chege zugi mitaba inza da gyudan kienla dyoba inza da rangwa yo mare rangwa mindu gyudan kienye shawang du gyubare shas samdaya dene korangi chowa delaya ane keji ngama da chima da chashe mangbola dyode yoba inza chashe kala yama dyoba che re mindu osempeke samda cheba cheya 안데네 운두시네가 저기 템바텐제 운두시네가 소위테도 다 두신 제바체야 되나 저기 다 제바이나 그 소와 템바냐샤 게알이야 안네 지기 띵에 진 공비야데 셰럽 게알이야 안 지기 타녀 루고로와 안데 소와레 미제 되니게 게바네 소와 디루 게어도 델리양아 저기 차바게 차베 원게 량은 바사기도와 선배 제바체야도 삼간스키 삼제야도 지상 나람사 나 저기 초월 기네 초월 대화 기도 차바기야기 근데야 nyomoba kind of ski to chebaje, Dinja, Denigi Gyälwa, Denigi Toal, Mipiki, Chaba Gyadi, Tigmino Sempiki, Chaba Mayagi, Tavishiagi, Bezjadi, and Zugidi, on those china sometimes the Kitchmachagarwa, that Denigi Dishadi, and that Gyälwa and Juda, the same da Chela Mipiki, that means a Digoshia.
To summarize then how we should engage in this meditation, first reflecting on the specific characteristic of feelings, then come to recognize the role that feelings play in that, come to see the presence of feelings, whether pleasurable, unpleasurable, or neutral, that accompany all consciousnesses. Thereafter, engage in the meditation on the general characteristics, so just briefly, I'll summarize just a few of them. In terms of impermanence, see how feelings change momentarily. They do not last. They do not last. So therefore, their arisal shouldn't bring any joy or fear, and their dissipation should not bring any joy or disappointment. Moreover, there's nothing worth longing for in terms of feelings or grasping at them, because they are in their very nature impermanent. Moreover, they are in their very nature suffering, because they come about in dependence on causes and conditions, and those causes are contaminated karma accumulated due to afflicted minds. They are in the nature of suffering. Therefore, they cannot bring lasting stable happiness on their own. They are not worthy of striving for. And then, moreover, feelings also dependent on parts, not just causes. They have parts such as moments of time and so forth. And do this meditation then with both mindfulness and wisdom. Hold the observed object with mindfulness, investigate it with wisdom. Here, really look and see the role that attachment plays with feelings, seeing how attachment arises from feelings of pleasure, longing for ever more, longing for it to last. So see how even attachment arises when suffering arises, attachment to be freed of it, wanting to be freed of suffering in every way. See thereafter how further causes for suffering are accumulated. So that in brief is how to meditate on this topic. And then in our next session, we'll look at the next two observed objects, that of mind and phenomena. So thank you very much.